Hey,
How you doing?
good to see you.
Nice to see.
It's been a while.
Yeah.
All right, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. This is the sixth, I think, session of the Spring's Education Policy Colloquium Series, program on education policy and governance here at Kennedy School. My name is Jim Pizer. I'm an academic visitor and former Secretary of Education, and it's an honor and privilege to be working with Marty West, who is here, and Paul Peterson, who I'm told is in the building, but or at least on campus. And may be joining us online today. After today, we've got two more sessions coming up through the end of the semester on Thursdays at noon. And normally we're here in Taubman, but actually next week we're going to be over at Gutman at the School of Ed for our session on the effectiveness of preschool on long-run student outcomes, featuring a presentation by Anna Marie Whitaker of the University of Delaware. And then our last session will be back here at Taubman in 2 weeks, again, Thursday at noon, with Tom Kane, who will be talking about the impact of federal pandemic relief on academic recovery. So both of those are going to be, I think, really interesting and important sessions. You can check out the full listing of our sessions, past, present, and future on the PEPG website, including video recordings of previous sessions. Today's session will be led by Tim Daly, who's the co-founder and CEO of EdNavigator. And it's about the record high levels of chronic absenteeism and its persistence beyond the pandemic era that we've just come through. When we're all aware, of course, of the historic declines in academic achievement in the wake of COVID and the underwhelming pace of improvement over the past 2 years measured by NAEP and state assessments. And as we've discussed in this forum, and in particular a couple of weeks ago, when we got the chance to see some interim assessment data from iReady, it doesn't look like achievement levels will be all that much better as measured by this upcoming session of year-end tests. So the impact of learning, the impact of remote learning is widely seen as a critical part of the problem. And since students have been back in school, efforts to catch them up have tended to lead to kind of typical rates of improvement, which means that they're still way behind of where they should be or where they would have been in the absence of the disruption of COVID. But it's becoming increasingly clear that these disappointing results are not just a function of what's going on in classrooms, but it's also a function of whether students are in classrooms to begin with. And we're thrilled to have Tim Daly here today to shed some light on this issue and on what's driving this problem and what insights he may have about what we can do about it. As I said, Tim is co-founder and CEO of EdNavigator, a nonprofit organization that helps parents and caregivers with one-on-one support to enroll their children in schools and early ed programs, to help them respond to educational challenges, and to help them deal with and navigate the special education system, among other things. Prior to starting EdNavigator, Tim was the president of the New Teacher Project, and before that, he was a social studies teacher in Baltimore. He has a master's in teaching from Johns Hopkins University and is a graduate of Northwestern. And after Tim's comment, we'll have ample time for questions and comments and discussion. We'll give priority to folks in the room, but we do have folks who are watching online, so we'll try to integrate their comments and questions into the discussion. So if you are watching online, please enter any thoughts or questions you may have in the chat, and we'll try to get to them before the session is over. As you might understand, of course, we're, in addition to live streaming, we're also recording this session, and the session will be posted on the PEPG website shortly after today. So all what we're saying is on the record, so keep that in mind as well. And with that, it's my privilege to turn the program over to Tim Daly. Tim.
Thanks, Jim. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so happy to be with you here. We are. How American schools caught long COVID. So I'll start by answering the obvious, which is, there it goes. Why am I speaking to you today? Am I an expert on absenteeism? I am definitely not. And if you don't believe me about that, give me like 5 minutes and I will persuade you that I'm not an expert on this. The genesis of my interest in this was last fall, I started a Substack newsletter. And I started that because one of my colleagues who's in the room today, Kate McGovern, and some of the other folks I work with at EdNavigator told me that I needed to stop sending them so much random stuff about news articles and trends that I was seeing, and I needed to find an outlet for those things to tell somebody else about it. And so the Substack newsletter was born, and I decided I would do kind of a topic every month and some kind of a deep dive into it. First one I chose was chronic absenteeism because there's been so much coverage of it last summer, and I ended up doing 3 parts, which you're welcome to read online. In the course of that, talked to lots of teachers and principals and superintendents. And it felt to me like at the beginning, this was just an interesting phenomenon. And the more I studied it, the more interesting it became. And I feel like the more I learned about it, I've done some follow-up things in the interim about not just student absenteeism, but teacher absenteeism. So I'm going to try and give you a little bit of an overview of what I think we've learned and also some of the big questions that remain. I'm very curious also what you all think about all of these things and what you think we should do about absenteeism.
Again.
There we go. Okay. We're several years into the pandemic, but for some reason, this is the year that chronic absenteeism went absolutely bonkers from a news coverage standpoint. There were headlines all the way throughout the year, and a lot of them like with a degree of panic, partly because we thought that absenteeism was an issue that would go away as the pandemic went away. And what surprised everyone is that it didn't. As schools returned to normal, they weren't in hybrid structures anymore. When there wasn't the same level of COVID infection, chronic absenteeism remained stubbornly high. And I think it's one of those things that caught us by surprise. And one of the things that I'm most interested in is why it caught us by surprise. But absenteeism also, I think, is a particularly interesting data point because most things that we study about kids are not collected in the same way everywhere. So for example, every state uses different tests, right? So it's really hard to compare how are kids in Texas recovering compared to say kids in Indiana. Some kids take NAEP in some of the national tests, but most kids don't, right? Those are all sample tests. All the international tests are samples. Absenteeism is one of the things that every school collects. It collects it in pretty much the same way, right? The kids are there or they're not there. And we've had a definition of chronic absenteeism that's been consistent before and after the pandemic. So the fact that we're collecting this everywhere, not based on samples, and that you really can compare things state to state, I think makes it a particularly, it's a fairly unique data point when it comes to thinking about what it tells us. And so here are the basics. And I apologize, this is not meant to be like an eye test for you all. Between 2017 school year and the 2021 school year, every single state that measures chronic absenteeism using the common definition saw an increase in it. The common definition is that students miss 10% of school days. There are some states that use a different definition, but this graphic comes from an Associated Press story that ran last summer that shows how much each state has increased. And one of the things that you'll notice right away is for most of these states, the red, which is the new status, is nowhere close to the blue. Like for most of them, these increases were quite large, or a few states where they're relatively smaller down near the bottom, but for most of them, it was very large. The other thing you'll notice is that chronic absenteeism was never really, really low. And in fact, there are loads of news stories that you can find back from like, say, 2015, where people were writing about how high chronic absenteeism was. So people thought it was bad before, now it's significantly worse. And in general, it was 15%, now it's about 25%. Now, remember the data that you're seeing here are for the school year that ended in 2022, not the school year that ended in 2023, because it often takes states a little bit of time to report this. So when this article ran in the summer of 2023, this data, the data they had that was comprehensive was already. The third thing is that we often talk about this in terms of kids who are older who might not want to go to school. So it's often this is framed as like, is high school interesting or not? But some of the biggest increases that we've seen in chronic absenteeism are among the youngest students. So kindergarten and first grade are big, also pre-K. But that's an important dimension here because these are not kids who are, waking up in the morning and saying, I can do all my work online. I'm in kindergarten, right? Like it's a parent who's generally making that decision for them. And so one of the dynamics to tease out here is we may have different things going on for different age groups, but the same thing is ultimately happening for all age groups, which is they're all missing their school. And then lastly, this issue is starting to get more attention. We probably won't have a ton of time to delve into it, but teachers are also missing more school days than before. This is a particularly interesting thing, though, because while every state reports student absenteeism, most of them do not collect or report teacher absenteeism. So in a few states where we have a really good window into that, like Rhode Island or Illinois, where they report it for every school, there's a lot to see there. And again, we won't go into it, but I did a separate piece on teacher absenteeism and pulled a few threads and found that in Illinois, much of the data is completely inaccurate. So you have some years of data where the schools are reporting that essentially none of their teachers had an absenteeism problem. And so I contacted them to say, is that actually right? Because in other years you reported that you had a lot of teachers absent, and the schools generally said, we have, that data is totally not accurate. We submit that to the state, but you shouldn't believe it. So I think there's a lot to uncover there. I do tend to think that the student absenteeism data is accurate. I haven't had as much reservation there, but it's not just students that are absent, teachers. All right, so here's the heart of the, I think, the interesting kind of discussion. There are lots of reasons that students might be absent. We have evidence for a lot of those things. Depending on which of those things we think are primary drivers, our solutions might be different. And so one category of cause that we might have would be barriers that exist that are really hard for schools to address. Those would include things like there are kids who can't come to school because the risk of COVID exposure is really high for them, or they actually are getting sick and need to stay home, or they need to stay home and care for siblings who are sick. Also, things like food and housing instability. These are things that schools can acknowledge and they can do as much as they can to mitigate, but they're probably not in a position to directly affect them. So many of the solutions that we might pursue would be around social safety net and wraparound services. Most of the discussion about chronic absenteeism leading in before the school year centered on this. And partly that was obvious that COVID was extremely real and the direct effects of it were front of mind. Then there are the barriers that schools might be able to address or are more within their control. And that would include things like busing. You hear a lot about bus driver shortages in certain communities. It's very clear that some school districts have cut bus routes. The buses have been late, or they're saying you need to live further away from school to even get busing. If you're closer to school, you need to get yourself there. Also, things like a lack of connection because kids spend so much time out of school. How many adults in the school do they have a connection with? How many fellow students they have a connection with? And is there that social fabric that would get them to show up? There's also a lot of talk about the mandatory quarantines. When kids have symptoms, don't come to school, or if you have had COVID, stay home for this number of days. And is that driving kids to stay home for longer than they otherwise would and pushing them into chronic absenteeism territory? You'll get, some folks would say, like, listen, you get like 2 colds a year and you're pretty close to that. Academic leniency is one that got almost no mention before. And then out of nowhere, a couple of things came out last fall that addressed academic leniency, basically meaning grade inflation. And some of them didn't even directly relate to COVID, but there was a paper out of North Carolina that looked at what happened when they changed the state's grading scale for high school to one where they had standardized 10-point bands. Before, they had some schools use those, and some they used another system where the bands were smaller. And basically it had the effect of making it easier for students in some of these schools to get a better grade than they got before. Essentially, like a 92 in some schools used to be a B, now it was an A. And the paper showed that the effect for students at the high end of the performance spectrum was that they just got higher grades. So they essentially seemed to do the same work and they came out slightly better in terms of their grade. Students at the lower end of the performance spectrum did not do that. They got the same grades that they were getting before, but they could get that grade while doing less work. And one of the ways that they could see them doing less work was they immediately started missing more school. So making the grading scale more lenient seemed to have some sort of an effect on attendance. All of that was pre-pandemic. So there was this kind of conversation that, are we making it easier for students to miss school and still kind of do relatively as well? And some school systems seem to have made their grading more lenient. So maybe parents didn't realize that missing school has academic consequences because the reporting was good. I already touched on teacher absenteeism. If we believe these are the main barriers, we might focus more on getting schools to change their policy, or saying you're now more accountable for absenteeism because it's in your control. Obviously, if we think the things at the top are the big things, having more accountability for schools around absenteeism doesn't make sense because they can't really control it. And my understanding is there was actually some discussion about this in Massachusetts at the state board level, right, about changing the school accountability system. And then lastly, there are things that are just broader social shifts. This would be things like parents just not seeing school as essential as they once did because schools were closed for so long. If it was okay for my child to miss that much school then, why can't they miss school now? Students who think, listen, if I miss school, it's not a big deal. I can just log on, get all the work done just the same way. Why do I need to be there to listen to the lecture when I can just as easily still hand these things in? I still learn the same stuff. And then finally, you'll sometimes hear talk about parents who are working hybrid schedules. They used to maybe push their child to go to school with the sniffles, but now they can keep them home because they can supervise them, so you don't have the same childcare. These things I would put in this category where it's not really something the school can control. It's really about the social norm of showing up. I think there's evidence for almost all of the things, at least anecdotal. Some of them there's pretty good evidence. I think that's research based, but there's a whole catalog of things. And what I generally find is that folks gravitate to one of these three categories, maybe a little bit more than the others. And it's not totally clear which of these things, if we focused on it, would drive things the most. I would say it's still a pretty open question, and there's work being done on all of them, which is again is why I find I don't recall an issue like this where you have like you're fighting like a 14 front war. You know, like there are so many different things that folks are trying to do to basically drive one metric of getting kids to not be chronically absent. Okay, so a couple of things that I want to share with you that have come up more recently that maybe give us some insights that we didn't have before. This is from a really recent poll that USC did and that they wrote up for the Brookings institution and at the Brown Center specifically. They asked families, and they said these were particularly families who in the first half of this year said their kids missed at least 6 days. What are the top reasons for absences? So is this, mostly or very true? And the number one thing was morning routines. The second most common thing was COVID protocols. Third was anxiety. Fourth is when a child's job schedule conflicts with his or her school schedule. That one was a big surprise because the fact that kids are working and potentially missing school because of employment is something that had not received as much attention. And for that to come up as fourth, I thought was really notable. Child has learning disabilities or other challenges that make skipping school and learning from home easier is also an interesting one that I think I had not heard as much about. And then lastly, school is boring. I think this is a great encapsulation of this because it's across the board. There isn't one single thing. The morning routines thing is notable to me because that falls into that category of some of the social norms and kind of getting back in the habit, but it also speaks to the relationship that parents and kids have and difficulty of saying, like, what's it going to take to get you up and out of bed. The second thing that I found interesting in this piece of work is that only 22% of the folks whose kids were missing a lot of school said it was difficult to catch up. So they're not particularly worried that it has dire consequences. And this is where you see a bit of a divide between the policy community, which is saying this is a huge deal. It's causing our recovery from the pandemic to be slower, and it's causing academic outcomes to be worse. And parents who are like, I don't see it as that big of a deal. And then lastly, this point about all the work being available online came up, at least for 32% of families. And I point this out because some of the things that we thought would potentially be positive effects of the pandemic, where we now have assignments posted online so they're more accessible and kids are more in the habit of being able to, so teachers don't have to do like that packet that they would give to a kid after they've been absent. That's really cumbersome to create, and then the student has to bring it back in. Now they can just go online and get their assignments. Some of those things are now emerging as potentially like double-edged swords. So it's easier to get those assignments and do them, but it may also make it easier for a student to think like, do I really need to show up at school, or for a parent to think that too. So it may be playing into the absenteeism picture. But I found this really interesting because it's one of the first times where we got to hear from parents directly, especially parents whose kids are missing school, what was behind it.
Is this all grade levels?
I think it was. I think that the kids that in the survey thing, but it's actually be interesting to look at that and see if they restrict. Are you curious for any particular reason?
Yeah, like anxiety seems like something that would be more
Yeah.
older kids and.
Good
that
point.
type of-
Well, and also the getting out of bed thing may
Yeah.
skew more towards
Yeah.
older kids. Yeah. I mentioned this paper. This is where you can find it about academic leniency in North Carolina. The link is right there, so we post the slides. I do recommend reading it just because it was something that made a lot of sense to me when I read it that I had really not been thinking about before. And I also share it because as this school year has gone on, this has come up more and more. I'll give a practical example where it came up quite a bit in just a second. Okay. reasons for hope. Are we going to have this level of chronic absenteeism forever? Hopefully not. There were two districts that I looked at particularly in the Substack series. One is Oakland Unified, which is large urban district, a lot of low income students, and it had one of the most acute issues with chronic absenteeism. At the end of last school year, they had 60% of their kids were chronically absent, which is for about 10 years. So the best that Oakland ever did on chronic absenteeism was not like the year before the pandemic. It was like 2012 or 2013. And so it had been creeping up and then really went into a different stratosphere. And there were some reasons why last year was particularly tough. One of them was they had a prolonged teacher strike. And so students missed some school there. And then I think they added some days at the end of the year to make up for that. The kids just didn't go to them. So some kids probably tipped into chronically absent territory. Shout out to Oakland Unified. It's one of the only school districts that posts its dashboard for chronic absenteeism online. So you can find it in real time, disaggregated, like it's a data geek stream. And that's one of the reasons that we know that at least as of when I pulled this data recently, this year, it's down to 30%. So doing much better. Oakland tackled this through a lot of community outreach. They have a bunch of local groups that are trying to connect with families. They're trying to do a lot of the supportive things to get kids back in school. And it really does seem like they're making some progress on it. I will note that it has been creeping up. And for a lot of school districts, kids do okay until the weather gets good. And then after the state tests are given, sometimes you'll see the surge at the end of the year because they had only been missing 8% of days, but then at the end of the year they miss a bunch. So I would not get too confident that that's going to land at 30%, but I still think they're going to show a really big improvement. And I think that is roughly consistent with what I'm seeing in general, which is I think we passed the peak. And I think the absenteeism is starting to come down. It's not coming down, to zero. And I think we're on a trajectory here, but will probably take several years still to get back to where we were pre-pandemic. But I think it's better news than we've had in the recent past. And that's in a district that obviously is struggling with all the problems I had on that earlier slide. They have families that are homeless. They have issues with transportation. They have staffing shortages. The second one, and this one, people had a lot of fun in the Substack series, poking fun at New Trier's expense. So New Trier Township High School on the North Shore of Chicago is one of the most affluent communities in the country, extremely lavishly well funded. They don't have any of the problems that Oakland has, right? Like they don't have problems staffing their buses. They don't have issues of homelessness among their student population. And it was very embarrassing for them when they had news reports last year that a quarter of their students were chronically absent. For their, notably for New Trier, the freshmen were almost never chronically absent, and all the seniors were. So it seemed like maybe there was a bit of they'd figure out how to game the system. But New Trier was also notable because their discussion about this played out in public, and they formed a committee to think about how they're going to change their policies. And many of their policies or their strategies really weren't the same as Oakland's. They had become very lenient about things like kids could still chair a meeting of the National Honor Society, even if they hadn't been in school that day, or play a sport, which historically wasn't allowed, but during COVID, they tried to be more lenient about that. They also got rid of time requirements where if you missed school, you had to make up your work in a certain period of time, so you could have more limited time. They gave kids more time or more opportunities to retake tests. So if you missed a bunch of days, then you took the test and you flunked it, you could just retake the test. And so there was a feeling that they had become too permissive around absenteeism. And even their student newspaper editorialized and said, we need to tighten up these policies because we're all taking advantage of them, which personally was the first time I'd ever seen something like that, like a student newspaper saying let's all admit that we've probably taken this too far. So they introduced the new policies this year, and they came out and reported at the end of the fall that chronic absenteeism previous year was 25% at that point in time, and this year it was down to 8.5%. I haven't been able to find out exactly what it is now, but my sense is that it improved. So two different approaches, two very different communities, but both of them doing much better this year than they did last year. All right, that's what we know. I'm curious what you all think about this. What do you all think schools should be doing? And which strategies should they be taking? And also, what don't we know about this topic that you think we should be researching?
Well, Tim, thank you very much. First of all, let me sort of kick off with a question and then sort of we'll open it up so folks here and online can start thinking about what they might want to ask or say. Couple of quick sort of statistics questions. So you said that the data is fairly consistent across the country. But I guess my question is whether, so when you get dig a little bit deeper, where there are some nuances that may affect in some ways the comparability from one state to the next. So and even the data quality within a state. So one is sort of when a student is counted late, like or sorry, is absent. So if they're late, sometimes if they're, they miss the first period, they're absent. In other places, it may be, well, if you just showed up anytime, you're still here. Another is the excused absence versus unexcused absence, and whether states deal with that in the same way. And also to some extent, and this may be less of an issue now, but the extent to which remote learning is counted. So if you are, you're actually online in a class, or you're engaged in some way through remote learning while you're at home, whether you're counted as present as opposed to absent.
Those are good definitional issues. For chronic absenteeism, one very helpful thing is that is just defined as missing school. It's unexcused or excused absences that total 10%. Some states then have a separate definition of truancy, which means unexcused absences, and sometimes they'll report both separately. Everything that you see here is for absenteeism, so it could be a combination of excused and unexcused. And to your point, I think that states and even districts define differently how many periods of a day you need to be there. And I think many of them actually flip-flop to that during COVID. So like some of them started saying, if you're here for any part of the day, you're counted present, and that wasn't their old rule. But especially during the period of time when kids were online, they generally counted a child as present for the day if they were on any part of the Zoom, like camera on, camera off, microphone on, microphone off. And for that reason, the best year of attendance most districts were reported is that year that was mostly online. That was that, like they had like very few kids or teachers chronically absent, and it started to show up in that next year when the schools were pretty much fully open. But I do think there is some inconsistency in how some of that is tabulated. My guess is that there's also inconsistency between what the policy is supposed to be and like what schools report. Schools may do things slightly differently because nobody's auditing whether the kid came in the third period or fourth period.
But overall, compared to other educational statistics, you feel pretty comfortable that this is, reasonably accurate. And
I think it's pretty good. Yeah. And I think the other thing is the vast majority of absences are full day absences. So the tardiness thing where the child going home early, that definitely does happen, but most of the absences are full day. And so those, I think, and most of the time when a kid attends, obviously they attend the full day too. So I think it probably like fuzzies up around the edges, but I think we'll see is probably accurate.
And then the other question is the extent to which we have data. You talked about the sort of impact obviously across states, but also across different kinds of districts and across different grade levels. Do you have some insight into the potential differential impact of chronic absenteeism with respect to socioeconomic status or other sort of demographic factors?
It all seems to flow the way that you would expect, which is that kids with more privilege and higher performance can weather absences with much smaller consequences for their achievement. And in general, kids who face greater disadvantages and who were not doing as well in school before COVID have tended to see the biggest increases in their absenteeism. So I think it does exacerbate inequality in the way you think.
So, but would higher income students be less absent, during at least the last several years, and less chronically absent than lower income students? Have they all sort of had similar levels, but with different effects on their performance?
They all went up, not at equal levels. So it's one thing that is definitely true is affluent communities for sure have seen the increase. They have rebounded academically a little bit faster, and I do think that their increases in absenteeism weren't as big, and they were also starting from sometimes a really low base. So like where 15% was the average before the pandemic, some of these districts were at 3 and 4%, and so they doubled, to 6 or 8 or 10, but they were still below what was the average for all districts before that. Then you get some one of the reasons that New Trier is so high, and you see this all throughout Illinois, is that Illinois has a lot of high school only districts. So you'll have multiple elementary districts that feed into a separate high school only district. So the whole kind of like Chicago suburban community has a big absenteeism problem because it's high schools. So that's where the kids are most likely to be absent anyway, and it kind of isolates it because it's only that particular grade span. But I do think it's a good example of where they probably always had, I'm guessing, between 10 and 15% absenteeism, which I bet the elementary schools that feed into it had that.
Yep. Great. Marty, you have a question?
Sure. So, Tim, this is really interesting to sort of think about. My hunch is that social norms have played a big role in what we're seeing overall, in part because of what you just described, like the increase in among the affluent families as well. And I think what seems really tricky is that during the pandemic, there was this message that was out that families were receiving, like, when in doubt, keep your kid at home. And it's your civic duty to not have them there.
Yes.
And that strikes me as possibly a sign of idea for some counter programming they could do now.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the research on absenteeism, there's, the student who's absent suffers, but so do their peers. Because the teacher is now having to deal with kids who have missed lessons, and when there's very high levels of absenteeism, it just makes the learning process very inefficient. And so it seems like maybe we need to get families to start to think, more in the lens, through the lens of the impact, not on their own child, because the Brookings data says they're pretty comfortable that they can get their kid caught up, but really what it means for the community.
You're opening a much bigger, it's a very good point, and I think it speaks to this larger thing that I have felt all of this year in school, which is that there's a hunger for things that are like shared and make meaning and make school memorable, and these things that almost had become out of fashion. But anytime you have all the families come up to do like a spelling bee or a science fair, there's a real hunger for that, and it's not just about your child; it's kind of about all children. To your point about the messaging, I think this is a real thing worth considering, because school nurses, for very obvious reasons, were saying you cannot send a child with a respiratory infection, a cold, who's going to cough all over everyone, both because they might infect everyone and because they're making everyone so nervous, right? So keep them home. There wasn't a moment where we changed that guidance formally, and for families, they are still operating under that to some degree. I think you've heard that in some of the messaging this school year, where they'll give more explicit guidance. One of the things I learned in doing the initial Substack thing was that the American Academy of Pediatrics does have guidance on when to keep kids home. I had no idea that they don't consider it a fever worth keeping a child home unless it's like 101 degrees or something. And I was like, most families are like, if it's over 99, but that's a world of difference there, right? And I was really surprised how much the medical guidance was and always had been, get the kids to school. If they stay home, it's going to be normalized. And the American Academy of Pediatrics has all these things about school avoidance and how it kind of germinates. And it was so different than what I was accustomed to hearing from schools around being very cautious about sending kids. I do think that probably, you called it counter programming. I just think explaining this to parents, here's the situation, here's how we'd like to enlist you in helping to resolve it, here's what you can do for your own kids and for other kids, and here's when we want you to keep them home, would be very helpful.
Don't want to monopolize, but I'll ask, have you looked at all into the financial incentives that school districts have around this? So, I know some states determine allocations to districts based on a single day count in October. Others do it based on average daily attendance over the course of the year, which it seems like would give you more of an incentive to get kids into school. Maybe that's a form of accountability for chronic absenteeism. And some people argue that districts that are facing challenges with chronic absenteeism should be, given additional resources to pay for it, but that might create perverse incentives. Is that, I'm embarrassed to say, I don't know the evidence on that.
I don't either. I have not looked at the financial incentives. I do think some states do fund based on average attendance, all the way through the year. So I do think it costs them money directly when kids are absent. It'd be an interesting thing to look into. One thing that I do think that some states then held schools harmless during the pandemic. So maybe it used to count, but they didn't do that during the pandemic to avoid the incentive to say bring sick kids to school. There is a little bit of a connection to the teacher absenteeism, which shouldn't be overlooked in this, because when the student misses 20 days and the teacher misses 15, they're probably not the same day. So it really is probably 35 days of instruction, or 33 or whatever it is, like most of that can really affect student learning. But when teachers are absent, we do know that that has a big financial impact because of the need to get subs. And that has been a red flag that a lot of districts have waived, that subs are expensive and hard to get, and that they're blowing through their sub budgets in new ways. I've definitely heard more about that, but I think it's a great area, not just now, but in hindsight, to see what were the potential financial ramifications of this surge in absenteeism in states where they fund on an average attendance basis. Who else?
For lack of better words, is there any way that you could do a robustness check on this data of absenteeism? I have 4 kids who went to public schools. Almost once a week, we would get a call from the school, and mostly the high school, saying your child wasn't here in period 3.
Yeah. Oh,
or
yeah.
period 6.
You're like, yes,
Or
he
you
is
were
there.
here, or she was here all the other times.
Yeah.
So leads me to believe that maybe some of this data isn't accurate,
Yeah.
and I don't know how you would test it.
I mean, especially speaking to the teacher absenteeism point that I made about Illinois, where some of it is just obviously wrong. I do think it probably would be interesting to audit some of that. And you can probably look for some of the patterns like you're describing, like if the child was here in all these other periods and they just disappeared for one, is it likely that they were cutting class, or is it likely that there was a mistake made in which bubble got filled in? I don't know if anybody has tried to, even at a small scale, see if those things are accurate. You will also used to get whispers, at least, of schools that for making themselves look good or accountability reasons would not turn in every absence, especially those end of the year absences, like that you're sort of like, do we really want to say only half the kids are here? Like that was really gonna hurt our number for the year. But I don't know if it's audited. It's obviously such a huge job for a state agency. They collect the data from the districts and put it on their report cards and whatnot. I don't know if they go in there and say, show me the raw data to see if it reconciles. Good question.
Maybe just sort of follow up to that, but more kind of on the solution side. So anecdotally, anyway, I've certainly heard that some parents are unaware that their child is chronically absent. Meaning not so much they don't know where their child is, but they just aren't sort of accumulating all the absences through the course of the year to know that, oh, they've crossed some meaningful threshold. And so one question is just the extent to which schools and districts can affect the numbers or improve their numbers by just letting parents know that, hey, your child is absent, and that's a problem, and importantly, it's adding up or it's on a trend that's going to be damaging to them and their academic achievement. And then the other part related to it, and I think we've sort of touched on it already, is just more like a public relations campaign and messaging on the part of a district, on the part of state officials, others, to say, you really need to get back into school, and it's important to be there, not just to show up when you want.
Yeah, Todd Rogers, who's here at Harvard, has done a bunch of work on this question. Do families know how often their kids are absent? And the answer is most of them don't. They think that their child is absent a perfectly normal number of days, even when it's pretty high. They do react positively to information and nudges. They've tested all these different ways of doing it, but there are ways, especially to reduce absenteeism among kids who are only marginally, they're a little bit high, but they may not necessarily be facing barriers to get to school. Then I think there's that other level where there really are barriers getting the child to school. And some districts have invested in the more personalized door knocking, like let's go out and talk to the family and figure out what we need to do to get them to school. And I think that is maybe necessary in some of those cases where the barriers are bigger. But I do think that just to like put this in perspective, like being chronically absent, most of the time it's just like a couple of days a month that you're missing. So like once every other week, you're home for a day. And I think for a lot of families, it adds up, but it's not necessarily something that's front of mind, because they're saying like, my child goes to school 90% of the time, like 90% is pretty good. But you could, if you're at 89%, you're chronically absent. And I just recently saw somebody who put this in perspective. So a couple of days a month doesn't feel like a lot. I think for a lot of families, it wouldn't trigger a lot of concern. But if you miss that much from pre-K through 8th grade, you've missed a full year of school before high school. A full year. Like that's how you get to 180. It adds up pretty quickly. And that also struck me, that like both things can be true. It can seem like not like a lot, but when you say a year of school before high school, that sounds like a preposterous amount of missing school. But I think it can add up like that.
Alexis.
Hi, Alexis, thanks for being here. So I'm with the Rennie Center for Ed Policy and Research, and so we're digging into this issue a lot
Yeah.
in Massachusetts specifically. I'm interested, the chart you had on the study from the Brookings
Yeah.
Institution about what caretakers are saying. Some of the language is interesting as I'm reading this, because I think it talked about how, like, what if we assume that these are the reasons? Has there been any discussion, studies, like appetite for asking students? So I think a lot of this
Yeah.
discussion is around, especially middle or high. I
Yeah.
wouldn't want to ask my 2.5-year-old when
Yeah.
he's going to school. But for older students, especially to Marty's point around like anxiety or like that general umbrella term of like, I don't want to get out of bed. Like it seems like there's a lot underneath that.
Yeah.
And at Rennie, we're struggling to find data or like even an appetite to go directly to the students. To
Right.
ask. Have you seen that anywhere?
Not much, and that doesn't mean that it's not there. I for sure that some of those things could be out there, and I've just missed them. But I would love to hear that. And what you're asking raises another thing that I don't have a great handle on this, but I think it's something that we should consider, which is some of the data that we have about what makes kids reluctant to go to school is from before the pandemic. So it's possible that the things that were the big drivers then were things like, I don't have that many friends, or I feel like I don't really belong, or whatever the case is. And that we can have, those could all still be present. And there may be some new things that didn't exist before the pandemic. And that does worry me a little bit, that some of what we know about what drives it and what may ameliorate attendance issues is all based in a paradigm that's now been a little bit upended. Because this started to come up for me when I was first talking to folks, and what you found, what existed in the literature was about the 15% of kids that were chronically absent before. And there were like, reasons that were listed for that, and they all made sense to me. But then when I talked to people, that was not what people in schools were talking about now. As issues, they were bringing up all these social norms things and whatnot that obviously wouldn't have been as relevant. And it made me think we might have two different categories of things going on here that I've not been able to tease out. But I think one of the ways we could tease them out is to hear more from students about it and what they think about their own attendance and all of that. And that probably also came to mind when the New Trier kids were editorializing in favor of stricter policies for their own attendance. I've never heard that.
You mentioned in Oakland, the long-term trend had been up
Yeah.
in the decade leading up to the pandemic. Was that also the case nationally?
I think it
realize I
was.
don't know.
Yeah, I think it was.
Because to speak to like what you were just saying, the factors before and after, I mean,
Yeah.
we know there's been this pretty dramatic increase in mental health concerns among adolescent high school students. And it seems to me that could have been playing a pretty significant role in sort of increasing absenteeism over time.
Yeah.
And it's interesting if you're right that with the passage of ESSA, that was one of the things that made chronic absenteeism part of the public conversation.
Yeah,
Because states
Many
were
people
looking
adopted
to,
it.
what can I
Yeah.
put in our accountability system? So it's interesting to think that the long-term trend was going up despite that.
Yeah,
And
I think it didn't get better.
Yeah.
I think people, this is more than speculative, so please forgive it in advance. But in general, I think it's very hard to find any indicator that's better now than it was 10 years ago. Like I would say almost everything from like NAEP performance leveled off and then started to kind of decline, absenteeism, mental health, like on almost every measure that you run across, it was slowly diminishing a bit before the pandemic. And then the pandemic usually set the whole thing a tilt. But on many of these things, there was a creep. And because Oakland has its data, I think it's goes back to like 2010 or something, you can see that slow increase and you can see it by subgroups. So something was going on before that. I don't know that every state had exactly that consistent one because I don't know that they all reported it right back that far. But I do get the sense, I always say about the pandemic that I think it probably came at an unfortunate time for us because I think there were probably some things that were already maybe not moving in a great direction. And we had just enough technology to convince ourselves that we could do school online. Whereas if the pandemic came 20 or 25 years before, our technology would never have allowed us to do virtual school. So we would have thrown ourselves into probably solving the problem of getting kids back in faster. It just happened at a moment where probably a bunch of factors came together. And I don't know that it caused all the issues that we see. I mean, in some cases, it exacerbated something that was existing.
Hi, my name is Megan. I'm an RA in Taunton. My question is about the, was it 22% figure we saw in the
Yeah.
saying that parents just like don't think it's like the chronic absenteeism is causing their children any problems in catching up to school. Do we have a sense of whether that's true or not? And like whether the perception of their schools or their children's performance is actually accurate in that it's not being affected?
Not one-to-one. I mean, we know that when kids miss school, they don't do as well. Like that part is easy to see. And in general, we can see that achievement hasn't bounced back in most of these districts. That is the place where I think one thing we have a really good handle on is that when parents think about performance, they think about grades. They don't think about test scores. Teachers would say, listen to what I say, as like, these are my comments. Like, oh, if you want to know how your child's doing, ask me. Because teachers know, or they would say that grades incorporate a bunch of things, effort and participation. And so sometimes they would say, don't put too much weight, but parents put weight on grades far and above everything else. And we do know that the grades have been good. We did a little bit of work at EdNavigator with some other organizations to look at a couple of school districts. And we found that while achievement went down during the pandemic, grades didn't. And there's a certain kind of student who is not proficient on their state tests. And they're missing a lot of school. They're chronically absent, but they're getting A's and B's on their report card in that subject. That student barely existed before the pandemic. Like that was like describes 2% of kids or something like that. It was something really small. In these districts, that was now a non-trivial number of kids. Like I think it went up over 10%. Maybe it was like 12% in one of these districts, meaning that like 1 in 8 kids is not proficient on state tests, is chronically absent, is getting A's and B's in that subject. So I do think that if I were a parent and I were hearing that, I would say, well, yeah, she was absent a few times, but she's doing fine. Like she's got to be. So I do think we'll have to look at that. That's a really sticky topic for districts because they were doing these things out of very humane impulses, and grade inflation is one of those things that like once it happens, how do you rein it back in? Painful for everybody involved. And so for the most part, it doesn't get addressed a lot. And I get it. Like I wouldn't want to be the teacher that's like, I'm going to be the hard grader, and give you really unpleasant messages after you've had different ones. Go ahead.
Hi, it's me here. My name is Emily and I work at public housing authority that served both, actually suburban Cook County, both some very low income suburbs and some very high income suburbs. And in places like, even in a place like New Trier, there are a handful of low income students. And I'm wondering if you know anything about how those students fared compared to low income students in primarily low income districts.
Oh, yeah.
Because I think a lot of the barriers that are specifically borne by lower income students or students from marginalized backgrounds might not be on the radar
Yeah.
at a school district like Trier in terms of addressing those.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't know. That is, but you're absolutely right. Like when it's a small slice of the student body, it may get completely overlooked in a way where it's a very like present and visible problem elsewhere. I don't know. I do think kind of separate from this, I think that's also true of student achievement. I think that students who are really high performers tend to get overlooked more in certain schools than in others, like because the major problem is that 65 or 70% of kids are below grade level. And so that gets all of the attention. And so a child who's succeeding is just not an issue in that. Whereas like at other schools where kids are doing really well, they have all these, honors and I bet that it could also be true of something like housing, just very overlooked. But I don't know.
I'm wondering how this connects to your work with EdNavigator.
Yeah.
So do you all see, and I don't know everything that EdNavigator does, but I understand it helps families make sense of their school options. Do you encourage or do families on their own sort of actually look at chronic absenteeism or absenteeism data in general to get a sense of whether this is a school environment that their child would thrive in?
So in a nutshell, what we do at EdNavigator is we take referrals from pediatricians. So they see families who have an educational issue that they're going to need assistance with. Usually it's getting their child enrolled in school or some kind of academic concern, like they need to be evaluated for special education and they need help going through that process. We do that in Boston, in the Bay Area, and in DC. And then we connect them to a navigator who's an educator that knows how the system works, that helps them with whatever the goal is that the pediatrician, the parent identified. Usually takes like 2 to 6 months. And then so hopefully we get that accomplished and then the case gets closed. So it's sort of like a relationship that has a beginning, middle, and end. We don't get referrals that are specifically for chronic absenteeism, where the solution would be, like develop a different home routine. Most of what we do is to help families interact with systems. So we're like helping them understand bureaucratic processes and registration things that they were told that like they didn't have the right paperwork, and so their child's been sitting at home, or they think they're waiting for a call from the district that may never come. Most of what we do is that. We do, though, in the process of that, see the ways that families interacting with institutions where there's huge power imbalances and knowledge imbalances. And most of the families that we're supporting also are non-English speakers. So all of the sorts of things that play into this that might prevent a child from being in school, they definitely relate. Plus, we're in the health world, so we also have kids who are missing school for health-related reasons. In the Bay Area, for example, we work with a neurology clinic. So we have kids who potentially like have a concussion or something like that may prevent them from being in school for some time. And so it's not directly related, but I would say it gives us a front row seat to the ways that individual families interacting with big complex systems introduces tons of challenges that then show up in the performance of the system. And I would say it's always been very clear to us that almost every program seeks to support the system to do better, but there's very little that goes direct to the family to just say, whatever the system looks like, this is going to help you maximize your path through it or minimize delays. And I think that would be, if I was going to say one thing about chronic absenteeism, I would think that's probably a place we should pay attention.
Hey, Tim, at one point in your presentation, you suggested that the trends are moving back down to kind of where we were before. So I guess the first question is, do you think we're actually going to see that happen, let's say by the end of the next school year, that we'll be back to sort of pre-COVID days? And if that's true, then it sort of suggests that the sort of COVID-related hypotheses around why students are absent may be interesting, like in an historical context, but no longer relevant going forward, which gets us back to the sort of core, let's say 15% of students who are chronically absent. Do you think we, I don't want to say should ignore the sort of continued gap between where we were and where we are, but should we be more focused on the 15% and less focused on the incremental 10% at this stage of the game?
I don't know how long it will take to get back to like the 15% base. It's a good question. Some of it is, it takes so long for the data to come out. So a lot of states release their absenteeism data when they release like their full report card for schools and how they did on their state tests and whatnot. And some states do that as early as like July and August, but there's other states that don't release any of that information until like October or November. I live in Illinois, and I think we're lucky if we get it out by Halloween most years. So that means it takes a while to even know how the most recent school year went, outside of instances where it's been publicly reported, or Oakland, who puts it up online. So one of the questions I think it would help us answer this is, I don't yet know how much progress we made last school year and what the trend line is. So it could be a recovery trajectory where next year we're back to 15%, or it could tell us that it's going to take 5 years to get that far. I do think that the question about I could view the question about the 15% two ways. One is, we may permanently be at a higher level than we were before, and we may need new solutions for that. And it may be actually we get back to the old level, and we can think about using what we learned during the pandemic to make 15%, 12%, and 10%. That could be the case. I think that this veers a little bit into like not the topic of the day, but so much of what we see in young people also is social disconnection and the trend of spending less time together. And that also predated the pandemic. So the amount of time the American high school teens spent with each other in I think it was 2012, it's like 2 hours a day. And that was down to under an hour by 2019 before the pandemic. So things that we may be facing other barriers that are larger social changes that aren't just school related, that will make it harder for us to sustain 15%, because one of the biggest reasons that kids go to school is to see their friends. And so I think some of that is, I just sense that we're fighting more than COVID here and the legacy of COVID. I think there are other streams that are feeding it.
That sounds a little more depressing the rest of your presentation.
I think
It's like
yeah.
social media needs to somehow go away or something like that.
Yeah,
before
and
we,
it's not just, you know, they don't spend as much time with each other regardless of that. It has been largely replaced with screen time, but they don't play sports as much. They don't participate in extracurriculars as much. When they're given the choice, they do more things alone than they did before. And I think those trends, if we had a whole different, you know, hour to spend together, I would say those things do worry me a lot. And I think we're playing catch up.
Just a comment again. For a decade, I've had my teenagers invite their friends, 2, 3, 4 of them, come to the house.
Yeah.
Sit in a circle and not talk to each other and just be on the phone.
Yeah.
So that's been a while. But at the same time, to sort of push back a little bit about, you said about how much time they spend together. My son, who's the youngest now, is in contact with his friends, I'd say 18 hours a day now.
Yeah.
Through the phone.
Yeah, yeah.
But I mean, and it's not just text, I mean, it's videos, it's.
Yeah.
And I mean, to each other.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
And the other thing I wanted to ask is, we're getting better and better about, you know, systems and how we count and, you know, all this other stuff. We've also had a bigger focus now because of the pandemic about school and looking at all this. Are we just getting better at tallying absenteeism?
Yeah, maybe. That actually could be true. The accounting system is more accurate. It's possible that that's true. And that it wasn't so different before, but we just have a better.
We don't have truants officers anymore. We have resource officers.
Yeah, true. Yeah, and also, I mean, this point was made, it became much more systematic because so many states made this part of their dashboard after ESSA was passed. And if we'd had that since the early 90s, we'd have a little more data that probably would be more comparable. So I think it's also, I think, a success story of this issue being raised on the radar by attendance works and others, people putting out a common definition to being adopted. So we are benefiting from the fact that this groundwork was laid by a lot of folks that were being very thoughtful about this issue well before the pandemic.
Michael, I think we've got a comment or a question online.
Yeah, this is from Andrew Solomon, who's CFO of Excel Academy. It's a network of charter schools in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. He says we have seen a big improvement in chronic absenteeism this year versus last year. We're still seeing much higher rates, though, among students with disabilities and multilingual learners, something you referred to earlier. Is that pattern evident in the data generally? Any effective interventions for those groups?
I do think it's evident generally, and I don't know of any interventions that have been shown to be wildly effective there, but it may speak to some of the things like when we went back to the reasons that parents were saying that their kids were having challenges, some of it had to do with students with disabilities, like having more reasons to stay out of school or having more difficulties getting there. That's a really interesting question. And it's also a helpful observation on both ends that like there's some student groups where it's still a big challenge and that things are getting a little bit better. I hope that stays. I hope they continue getting better, and I hope the other student groups are able to get back into school too.
Just following up on the reference to truancy, have there been changes in the way districts think about, for lack of a better word, enforcement?
Yeah.
Or either sort of in a more sort of more enforcement or less enforcement around truancy, and whether that, you know, works, or whether actually, you know, sending the truant officers out, if they even exist under that name, it's really just as ineffective anyway.
Yeah, most of what I know about this is it's through the headlines. I think that it's been a little bit all over the place. My sense is that before the pandemic, people were moving away from that because they thought it was not effective, expensive, and also you're dragging parents into family court and prosecuting things that don't make them likely to solve those problems, and could be negative and just very disengaging and disproportionately falling on low-income families, marginalized families, all of those things. But then more recently, I think as districts have struggled with absenteeism, you have seen some of that creep up again. I almost brought a headline from DC where the mayor in DC just announced a much more aggressive stance on that. And some of it, it wasn't prosecuting parents. It was more of the like, you're getting a stern letter in the mail that says we have a mandatory attendance law. Your child is not in school. You need to get your child in school. Even some of those things, which they're definitely punitive in nature, but they're not like very concrete penalties. That I think some of that had gone by the wayside, and I do sense that there's maybe an increase in that sort of official notification and the categorization of like, you are the parent of a truant student. You didn't bring any absence notes for all of these days. I sense some of that is happening, but I don't have a great handle on how how common that is everywhere. And there definitely has been a shift in the way we handle discipline as well, moving away from sort of enforcement and security officers in buildings to resource officers. I know that a lot of school districts have been investing in what they see as more counselors and mental health supports in school to try and handle some of this that way. And I would just say you get mixed views of how well it's working. Some people really do feel like it's working very well. There's other people that don't feel like it's working as well, and their feeling is like, we need to tell the parents to get the kids in school. Like that's the kids are not coming, they're not missing days because they truly are so anxious that they can't come. I know that kid, he could be in school, and we should take the more direct route. I don't have a sense of whose opinion is more valid, but I would say it's you get a diversity. You got a question?
Well, I guess I was thinking like you had mentioned, if we don't go back to the sort of 15% baseline that we had before, and we have entered this new realm of heightened absenteeism, I wonder if you can speculate around like what you think that means for the future of schools. Like, should schools be, should they be dramatically different than when they were prior to the pandemic? Because like when the pandemic struck, everybody was like, let's rethink education, do this differently. And everybody's like, no, let's get back in there and let's accelerate learning.
You guys will, somebody in this room will probably be the one to figure this out, but there are two camps that I see with this. And there's the very like technologically optimistic camp. And they're like, listen, some of these kids are not going to go back for the traditional school day. We're going to offer them something that's more hybrid. It's going to be more flexible. That job that's keeping them from getting to school, we're going to embrace that job. They're going to be able to get what they need. And here's all the tools that we're going to make available. And AI is going to create greater flexibility and all that. And so I think that there's a lot of work that's afoot out there from folks that are anticipating that we're going to have to break away from that. But there's this other camp that I also sense is out there, and their feeling is we are going to solve this when we let schools get back to doing what they do well, and we're going old school. Like we're gonna make these things like we're getting the kids offline. We just spent $1 bazillion on one-to-one iPads. We're getting rid of them. Like the kids are staring at the iPad. Half of them are on YouTube during class. We overinvested in technology, and we're doing the like kids talking to each other thing. I mentioned science fairs and spelling bees. Other like random themes that I hear a lot about this year are anything that is kind of makes like school kind of a communal or shared experience. So a lot of schools that said we're not reading Of Mice and Men together. Like some people think it's stupid. Kids are gonna have more say in what they read. They're like, we're reading in class now. Like we're all gonna sit together and we're gonna read the same book. Again, this kind of old school impulse. And I think for those folks, they feel like let's let schools get the basics right again before we start innovating, because we've given them so many things to do. And we asked them to like invent online ways of schooling overnight. And what we learned from that is the teachers are exhausted, the students aren't coming, it was too much too fast. So I think you've got both of those impulses. I think probably both of them are going to show up in different ways. But it's not exclusively the like, let's use tech to solve our problems thing that I'm hearing also from the other one. Where they intersect is the best event any school can have is something where parents come to school and they take photos with their kids. That's because it combines the like, I'm there and I'm in person and I can put this online and grandma can see it. And that's why like, at least if my kids are in 7th and 8th grade, like the science fair, the social studies fair, the mapping, like parents show up for those things now because they're like, this is so great. So I think there are probably lessons that we can learn from that about like how we can get kids back in school and get the parents kind of invested in.
So making school more Instagram worthy is
That's
the strategy.
That should have been the title of this. Get kids back in school by making it.
Yeah, so they can take pictures of themselves too while they're there, so more selfie opportunities. If you were to sort of make recommendations to folks in the research community about what needs to be done here to better understand not only what's going on, but maybe what can be done about it, what would your sort of recommendations be?
I think get at some of these underlying causes and take some of the weight off schools so they don't have to guess and speculate. Like they're trying to figure this out, and we're essentially putting them in a situation where they can plausibly try every strategy under the sun because there are so many ones that I think have some evidence behind them. So like work fast so school communities can like put their resources to good places or to good purposes. I think that's one. I also think getting, if we have multiple things going on, or there are different drivers for kids of different ages or kids of different backgrounds, that is not super apparent yet. You know, like, so getting it, most school communities don't serve every kid or every age level or every demographic, right? So I think giving them some sense of that might help, because right now, I think they're probably just like going with instinct to some degree. So I would love to see that. And then the last thing might be folks that can either aggregate the data or clean it and make it accessible, because I think the folks that are trying to do research on this, you have to get the data from this state and that state, and it takes forever. And so people that have great insights and quantitative abilities to work with it, I don't think they have a very easy time getting it. And so I think that would also be, from a policy standpoint, something that would like allow us to crowdsource, for lack of a better term, a little bit. I don't sense that that's happening.
Seems to me, Marty, you would have a better sense than I would, that there are probably some fairly easy RCT opportunities here where you've got, you know, a pretty significant percentage of your students who are absent. And some of them get a treatment and some of them don't, and
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Todd Rogers' work, I mean, he's on the faculty here and has started, you know, not just in his research, but a company that works with school districts to do exactly that.
Yep.
I mean, that's good for individual level treatment or maybe school level strategies in the context of a large district. It's harder for like a more collective social norm type strategy.
Yeah.
You know, when I open up a podcast now, every other time it's Secretary Tutwiler telling me to get my kids in school,
Yeah.
like that's and that's meant to work again through community norms. That's a little harder to study.
yeah. But even on the sort of at a localized level, you know, messaging from the principal or the superintendent to parents. Anyway, it seems like there's opportunity there to, at a minimum, at a localized level, but that could produce some more generalizable findings to do some productive work there.
Yeah, I agree.
Any other thoughts or questions before we close? Tim, any final words of advice or wisdom?
No,
from
thank you. You guys, thank you for all your attention, but also the questions were great. I feel like I learned a lot and have a lot of things to think about going away from this. And I hope, again, somebody in this room is going to just take this ball and run with it and figure out all the solutions. So thank you, guys.
Great, thank you, Tim. Remember, next week we'll be over at Guthrie Library.